right, so welcome guys. My name is Coach Hall, and today we're going to be doing an AP Lang Q&A. So I got some questions over on the community tab on YouTube, also on Instagram and TikTok. So I want to try to answer as many of those as I can. So if you have a question that you want to ask, then go ahead and pop it in the chat and I'll try to answer everything that I can. So if you guys are preparing for the test on May 12th, I want to go over some tips for you guys that are specific to the paper test. Now, some of these will also pertain to the digital test as well. So I got a lot of questions about multiple choice, and basically a lot of students are really nervous about the pacing. So I do have some tips for that I want to go over. So first of all, it's important to understand how the exam works. So if you're taking the paper test, you're going to go into your exam room. The person proctoring your test is going to have like a script that they have to read. And the very first thing you'll do as far as testing stuff is your multiple choice section. So the essays come later. And hi, David, how are you? And so you're going to have 45 questions to answer in 1 hour. So it's not a ton of time, but it is manageable if you pace yourself. Now, I have found that my students tend to take a little bit more time on those reading passages as opposed to the writing passages. Now, the writing passages are not essays, they're multiple choice still. So one of the things that I've told my students to do is to practice reading the questions first. Now, if you're taking the digital test, you can't do this because basically you can't go back to questions, which is kind of frustrating, but it's the College Board's policy. So on the paper test, this helps some students. Now, I have had some of my students be like, nope, I have to read the passage and then the questions. But I have found, at least for me, if I read those questions first, not the answer choices, just the question part, then it helps me know what I'm supposed to be looking for. And what I like to do is I like to bracket off, like if it says in lines 20 to 25, I like to bracket off that and put like a little mark so I know to go that way and like look at that part because it kind of draws your eyes to it. So I approach it very systematically because you don't have a lot of time. You're not reading for fun here. So that could be a tip to help your pacing is to read the questions first if you're doing the paper test. Something else to consider is that because each question is really only worth 1 point because there are 45 questions and it's 45% of your composite score, don't linger too long on one question. Now, as a high school student, I did this. I hated to move on unless I knew I was right, but there are 5 answer choices. You're not going to know if you're right or wrong, so give it your best guess. Use process of elimination, but if it's taking you too long, you have to move on. Now, I do have one student this year who is way better at the writing questions than the reading. So her game plan for the paper test is to go to that third passage, and she's going to answer all the writing questions first and give herself as much time as she needs, and then she's going to go back to reading. Now, again, you can't do that on the digital test. You can only do it on the paper test. But we think that's going to give her the best chance because she's kind of on that border of like a 2 or a 3 composite, and she's been working really hard. So we're going to see if it works. Fingers crossed that it does. So basically, you're going to encounter 2 reading passages and then 3 writing passages. The writing passages are a bit shorter and have fewer questions. The reading passages are usually a little bit longer and have more questions. Another quick tip about multiple choice is if the passage is really hard, don't get stuck on it. You can come back to it. Just really be sure on that paper test that you're answering the question that you're supposed to be answering. So like the bubble sheet, do not mess that up because that will be really stressful for you. So make sure you're actually matching stuff up. So those are some just general test taking tips. Obviously, they don't work for everybody, but they are things you could, in theory, practice between now and then. So hopefully that helps. If you guys have tips that you think would help other people, please feel free to leave those in the chat as well, and I'll shout them out because you guys are students, so you have a different perspective, and we want to make sure we're helping everybody. All right, so is our AP reading questions a lot like the reading questions from SAT? Yes, they are. I actually have my students use SAT practice questions because there used to be 10 release tests, but I think they took some of them away, but there's maybe 6 or 7 on the College Board. It's like the SAT suite or something like that, like SUITE, suite of assessments. It's called something like that. If you look up SAT practice tests and you choose the ones that are from the College Board, they have the test, and then the answers are usually in a separate document. Now, as far as what you should be looking for, usually the first passage on the SAT is a fiction passage. Ignore that. It's not going to help you with AP Lang. but look at the ones that are nonfiction, so the other passages. Now, for AP Lang, they're not going to ask you the questions that say, what is the best evidence? So I tell my students to ignore those. If you're actually taking the SAT, it can help you, but that's not how they phrase it on AP Lang. Also, there's at least one passage on the SAT that has like charts in it usually, like in a couple questions about charts. You're not going to have any multiple choice questions about charts as far as I know. The only time you would see a chart is maybe on your synthesis essay. So it could help you practice interpreting a chart. But if you're looking for questions to skip, I would skip the evidence questions. I would skip the very first passage that's fiction. They might call it like a literary narrative or something. And I would skip anything about a chart as far as multiple choice. But the rest of the questions are pretty accurate. They sometimes give you a double passage on the SAT. And because we don't get to see a lot of the multiple choice passages as teachers, though we do have access to some stuff on AP Classroom, I don't know if the double passage will really be helpful as far as like, I don't think you guys are going to get a double passage on the AP Lang test. But the way the double passage works is they ask you questions about passage A, then B, then both. And so you could at least answer the questions about A and then B. And that would give you extra practice as well. So yes, I do actually recommend the SAT. ACT, I don't know. I feel like it's not as closely tied to it. It's good practice, but SAT is by the College Board and they have more stuff available. So I would recommend SAT stuff. What's the best way to improve on multiple choice? Okay, really good question. If I were trying to prepare, I would look at practice questions. And then if I got something wrong, I would look at the answer explanation. Now, sometimes the answer explanations are really not helpful because they're almost condescending. They're like, oh, of course it's this. But try to think like the test takers, try to learn what the distractors are. That would be my best guess. And like learn your habits. So if you're really good at a certain type of question, then you want to know that. Also, if you're like really not great at a certain type of question, that could be helpful too, because if you're running out of time and let's say you're not really good at questions that deal with like purpose, well, it could be tempting to linger on that. But if you're like, it's not my strong suit anyway, I'm just going to guess and move on, then you could free up time for other questions. So not all students have trends, but if you find that you have a certain type that you're good at or that you're missing, that's good information to know. I did an exercise like that with my students and most of them didn't have trends. So it kind of backfired, but they were able to like learn from the ones that they got wrong, which I think is really important. Okay, so let's see. What should I do to prepare for the argument essay? Okay, so in 2019, they asked about like the overrated prompt. And this one threw a lot of students for a loop because it was very different than previous years. So in previous years, a lot of like historical knowledge of current events or science, stuff like that could help. So for those types of questions, I would recommend students try to think of a couple things that they want to learn more about. I would try to relate it to like either social progress or like maybe like a famous person who is integral into change. And I would maybe like listen to a couple of podcasts about that person or event or like a TED Talk, just so you can be an expert on a few different things. You don't want to try to be an expert on everything. If you're also in like an AP history class, like I know if you're an A-push, you already took your exam, but chances are you know about certain political figures. So maybe brush up on your knowledge of those things in case you can use it for evidence. But if you get a prompt like the overrated prompt, where it's like, choose one thing and discuss it, that's a little bit harder. So the key is to play to your strengths regardless. So I think there's a couple things you can do to practice. Maybe if you have time, choose a couple areas of interest that you want to know more about and kind of try to study that way, I guess. But also just really work on like your argumentative style, because that can help as well. You want to make sure you know what they mean by specific evidence and a line of reasoning, those kinds of things. So yeah. And like I said before, if you guys are just joining us, feel free to type any questions you have in the chat. And if you have tips that would help somebody else, by all means, feel free to post your tips, because we want to learn from each other. Because what works for me and my students might not work for everybody, but I'm happy to share the advice that I have. I've heard that reading the first and last sentence of every paragraph and then reading the references is better than reading the whole passage. I have heard that too. It can help. I would say if you're really pressed for time, that is like a good technique because you get the gist of it. I've also heard of people doing that in the synthesis essay when they're reading the sources if they are running out of time. So I would practice that skill before I did it on exam day. But I have heard it work for some people. So I wouldn't dismiss it, but I wouldn't necessarily like try to do it on the exam without having practice, if that makes sense. Is it possible to get perfect scores on all 3 essays? Technically, yes. So actually what happens is your essays are scored by 3 separate people. So essays are like not scored by the same person. So the AP readers are trained in one essay. So it's either synthesis, rhetorical analysis, or argument. And they're trained in one prompt. So we know that there's going to be different prompts for each of the 3 tests because there's the May 12th, there's one later in May, and then there's one on like June 7th. So you're going to have somebody who's like an expert in the prompt that they're answering. Like that's helpful. Now, I had 2 former students who took the lit exam tell me that most of the kids in the room had one prompt, but a couple of them had a second prompt, and they were all taking it on the same day paper test. Those prompts have since been released. They will actually release the prompts 2 days after. So if you guys are taking the test on Wednesday, teachers are not supposed to talk to you about the prompts, but when they release them on Friday, like 48 hours later, we get to see them like everybody else. So if you are taking like a later test like May or June, and you're like, oh man, I got to see the prompts, those are not the same prompts you're going to be answering. So you can get a perfect score on all 3 essays, and they're not graded by the same person. So it's more fair that way, I guess. As far as how to do that, you want to be really mindful of your evidence and commentary and the sophistication point. Now, is it likely that someone would get perfect 6s on all 3 essays? Probably not, but is it possible? Yes, absolutely. So really look into the sophistication point, I guess, if you're trying to go for perfect scores. How hard is it to try to get it? Is it worth it? Okay, so here's my opinion on the sophistication point. It's just my opinion. I think it's worthwhile for students to know how to earn it, but I don't think everyone is capable of earning it. And I don't mean that in an offensive way at all. It is sometimes called the unicorn point. So what I do with my students is I tell them how to earn it, and we practice different skills to try to get them to write better, because that's my ultimate goal. I want them to be prepared for college and like career. And like, yeah, if they get a good score on the test, that's awesome. But I don't want people obsessing over the sophistication point. Now, I do have some students who are really strong writers who like it's their goal to earn it, but it is challenging. That's not to say it's impossible, but I think there's a lot of factors. I think some students are better at writing certain types of essays as opposed to others. Sometimes it's the prompt. Like even for me as a teacher, there's some prompts where I'm like, I don't love this one. So can you earn it? Absolutely. I would say even if you don't earn the sophistication point, but you're trying to, it can help your evidence and commentary, more specifically your commentary. So ways to do that would be situating the issue in a broader context. So for rhetorical analysis, there's a few different ways this could work. For the Gandhi prompt, if you're familiar with that one, they tell you in the beginning that he wrote the letter in, 1930? And India didn't gain its independence until 1947. They did, in fact, march, which is what he's alluding to in this letter. So you could use that historical perspective. You could also talk about how England had like colonies all over the world. So you could kind of like zoom out and kind of go beyond the passage to situate it in a broader context. That might be one way to do it for rhetorical analysis. If the passage is, let's say, like a campaign speech, and you know the person ultimately ended up winning, let's say, the presidency, you could talk about that, especially if you know about their presidency. If it's a commencement speech or a funeral, and there's like a deeper message there, you might be able to talk about how that message applies to other situations. I might save that for like a conclusion though, because you don't want to get off topic on a tangent. But one way to earn sophistication is to situate it in a broader context, which just means like looking at the broader perspective. For argument and synthesis, a way to situate it in the broader context is maybe to think about either like historical info, if it's relevant, or the future. Like, what are the implications of this? How will it help society? How could it harm society? That kind of thing. Another way to earn sophistication is through your writing style. So regardless of whether or not you're going for the sophistication point, try to vary your syntax. Syntax means sentence structure. If all your sentences are the same length, they're really choppy and it doesn't read well. So practice varying your sentence length by putting those dependent clauses perhaps at the beginning of a sentence. Another way to improve your writing style could be to include higher level word choice. Don't use words that just sound smart, because a lot of times readers see through that, but avoid lower level words like a lot, very, good, bad, thing. Like, take those out of your vocabulary if possible. If you have time to go back and edit, that might be a good time to look at your word choice. Don't stress about it too much as you're writing, but writing style can help. I have seen some sample essays where students have included quotes and proverbs and that kind of stuff. And a lot of times students ask, like, do I need to be memorizing these things? No, but it did help that person. Because remember, when you're writing the essay, you're making rhetorical choices. So if you are someone who's interested in like creative writing, then you might want to try that vivid style. Now, don't turn it into a creative writing assignment. Follow the prompt and the task, but that could be your way into sophistication as well. And then another way to do it, more for synthesis and argument, I don't really see how you would do it very well for rhetorical analysis, though, is addressing the counter argument, like a counterclaim and a rebuttal or concession and refutation. Now, a lot of times when students do this, they think if they just include it, they get sophistication. That's not how it works. It has to truly help your argument, so it has to be well developed. So part of the reason why that could work, though, is that it's examining the tensions. So for instance, when you're given a synthesis prompt, they'll kind of tell you some people think this, some people think this. Once you've asserted your position, if you can kind of look at why other people think something else, that could be like addressing that tension there. So one way to kind of practice this, in my opinion, is to look at those released essays from the College Board from 2018 and 2019 that were scored on the 6-point rubric, or rescored, I should say. Look at the ones that got a 6, read the commentary to see why, especially if you're really good at like modeling after something, just kind of see what they're looking for. So those are kind of like, I guess, my best tips for sophistication. I do have some videos about sophistication if you want more detail, but like I said, like, it's something you want to aim for if you're ready, but if it's going to stress you out, really focus on evidence and commentary. That's so much more important for most students. Okay, so how should I review and practice for the exam outside of school? Okay, a couple quick things you could do. Use SAT tests to practice, potentially. If you haven't done the 17 questions in it's called the course description, or CED, from the College Board, it's this really long PDF document. If you type in like AP Lang course exam description, then you should find it. It's like 150, 200 pages. Scroll toward the bottom, and there's like a practice reading set and a practice writing set. And then the answer keys a little later on. That could help. Those are official questions to practice with. I would also practice writing essays, especially if you're worried about pacing. So use like, I would say relatively current prompts. Like, I don't give my students prompts that are much before like 2010 at the earliest. Like, I try to keep it really current, because the people who wrote the test in like the 90s, things have changed since then. But practice a timed write if you can, and practice in the way that you're taking the test. So if you're doing the paper test, practice handwriting it on a piece of paper with a blue or black ink pen. Another thing to do if you have time is a double essay. So what I mean by that is like time yourself for the length of 2 essays and go from one to the next, because that'll help you with your pacing. And it's also like the testing endurance that you might need. So those are some things you can do to practice. I do have a separate video about that as well, somewhat recently on my channel, if you're looking for more tips. Okay, just gonna scroll up here and make sure I didn't miss anybody's. Would you lose points or credibility if you write about personal experience? No. Now, okay, don't put personal experience in rhetorical analysis. It does not belong there. For synthesis, it can be harder depending on your prompt, but if they ask you about something that you have experience with, go for it. But make sure you're still citing the appropriate number of sources. It would just become like extra commentary, I guess. The way I see students use personal experience the most is in argument essays. And again, I do have a video about this too, in case it helps. But some tips for that are make sure that the personal experience is relevant. You need to provide appropriate context because remember, the person reading your essay does not know what you're talking about because it's happening to you. So give like a quick summary. And then also the really important part is the commentary, which is going to be the reflection. So usually if you're going to include personal experience, it has to deal with like some kind of like growth or something. So one example of personal experience in an essay that worked well is the 2018 prompt about exploring the unknown. It's one of the essays that got a 6. I don't remember which one off the top of my head, but the girl or boy who wrote it, the student, was talking about, I guess, like ropes climbing or like a ropes course and how they were really hesitant at first. And they explained the whole situation. It was one paragraph. And then like they said, like they explored the unknown essentially, and it led to like a love of this, and they continued to do the hobby. So it was meaningful. If they had never gone back to that ropes course, even if they conquered their fear, it probably wouldn't have been meaningful personal experience. So you do want to make sure it's meaningful and relevant. But if you're looking for a good example of how that was executed, then try to find that particular essay. Again, it was 2018, Exploring the Unknown, so Q3, and it was one of the rescored essays. But that was an example, I think, of it being done really well. But yeah, you can use personal experience. Let's see. Do you have any tips for when we generate evidence for the argument essay? Okay, so play to your strengths. So I like it when students pair their evidence. So basically like, and this works for most types of essays, but it's not going to work for every prompt. But if you only give one example and then some commentary in your paragraph, it's probably not going to be very convincing. So if you can give like a topic sentence, evidence, commentary, and then transition and give like a related example, and then so like more evidence and commentary and then a concluding sentence, that's going to be more developed. So if you can pair your evidence, like couple them together, that usually is going to lead to more development and it's going to be more convincing. Because remember, with argument, you're trying to convince your reader of something. Like you want to persuade them, you want them to believe your argument. So when you're generating your evidence, I usually tell my students, like if they have time to kind of like list their ideas out, I use the acronym CHORES, but there's others. CHORES stands for current events, history, outside knowledge, which is like a catch-all category, reading, experiences, and science. And so I have them kind of brainstorm that way. And then they choose like their top evidence and then they group it to try to figure out what order they want to put their points in. On exam day, you might not have a lot of time to do that. So you really just want to make sure your evidence is examples that you can talk about clearly and really relate to your point. And so ask yourself after you've got your evidence, like, what does this show? Like, what does it reveal or illustrate? Like, what's the why? Because with evidence, there has to be commentary. Let's see, thoughts on an open or closed thesis. Okay, I'm laughing because this is such like a hot topic in like AP teacher groups. I teach a closed thesis to start because it's defensible and I think it's a good starting point for my students. As they get better at it, we work on tweaking it to make it stronger. And then by exam time, some of my students prefer an open thesis. That being said, I have seen some open thesis statements that were so open that the rhetorical choice was not present or like not clear, or they missed like the purpose or something, and it just seemed like a summary. The reason why some teachers like an open thesis, in my opinion, is because when you go to college, especially when you're writing longer essays, you need more of an open thesis because you're not going to list all of your points for a 20-page paper. So we want to be a little bit more broad. You're not writing a 20-page paper. You're writing like a 3, 4, or 5 paragraph essay in 40 minutes. So I have zero issue with a closed thesis statement. I think if you're struggling, write a closed thesis statement. Can a closed thesis statement still lead to a really good essay? Yes. So my only opinion on it is do what works best for you. I give my students sentence frames and we work on like tweaking the wording, but I am not the type of teacher that says you must do open and not closed, but I'm also not going to deny an open one either. I just think there's more important things to worry about. So do I have an opinion on it? More students write a closed thesis statement because of the pressure of the test. I don't have an issue with it. Would the SAT essay help? Yeah, so they're phasing out the rhetorical analysis essay on the SAT, which I'm kind of sad about, but that's neither here nor there. So some of those prompts could work, but like to me, they're not as hard. Like, cause there's like two, or there used to be, I don't know if they took them down. There's like two SAT prompts. One was something about like, let there be dark. I used that one with my students. And there was another one about like why literature matters. Both good prompts, but they just, to me, didn't seem like the same caliber as what the College Board puts for Q2 rhetorical analysis on the AP test. So if you're looking for practice, it could work, but they use a different rubric too. So just keep that in mind. How can I improve multiple choice? Okay, so I addressed this a little while ago. Pacing is important, so don't lose track of time. Don't spend too much time on any one question. For me, when I take tests, I didn't do this in high school. I started doing this in college, and this would only work for those of you taking the paper test. But basically, I read the questions first, not the answer choices. But I just want to see what they're asking me about. Like, what am I supposed to be looking for? And like, I'll bracket stuff off. So if it says like in lines like 20 to 25 for question 2 or whatever, I'll put like bracket off lines 20 to 25 and I'll put a 2 in the margin. So again, it only works for paper tests. I would practice this. Like, don't try anything crazy on exam day. I've done this technique with my students in the past, and it's usually 50-50. I've had some kids say it totally helps, and I've had other kids be like, no, I like to just read the passage first. So that could be something as well. And then like eliminate answer choices you know are wrong. So if it's partially wrong, like if a part of it doesn't fit the passage, it's all wrong. Don't try to justify wrong answers. And if you're taking the paper test, I don't know if this is like true, but I've heard if students like literally cross out the answer like all the way across, not just like cross out the letter, it's better because, I don't know, it was some study I was reading. It said like, if they don't cross out the whole answer, then you're still likely to read that answer and it wastes time. But if the line goes all the way through it, you're less likely to read it. I don't know. So that could be something to try as well. So if I only use historical evidence such as push events, is that bad? No, I don't know that I've seen a release sample that only focuses on historical events, but like history is such a broad topic that if you're focusing on like events that are related but from different time periods, or like they have different outcomes or whatever, it could be fine. So I would just play to your strengths on that. Like, go for what's going to be convincing. That's going to be specific evidence. Because technically speaking, we do look at these as a rough draft. So I would much rather you write about something where you're confident in it and it proves your point, as opposed to trying to like go for a different category, I guess, where you're not as strong. But like, I do feel like I have to give a disclaimer here. I haven't seen an essay that only focuses on history. But like, unless it was like, I suppose if the prompt like led you to that, that's fine. But like, my best advice is to just choose the evidence that like best fits what you want to say. Like, play to your strengths. And if you are in a push and you're like, I know history really well, if it fits the prompt, I say go for it. I struggle with time management. I write slow. Do you have any tips to be faster? Cut the fluff. Do not write a wordy intro. Worst case scenario, just write a defensible thesis. But if you can write a sentence or two of what I call context, that's usually good. So for synthesis, the context might be like a little background about the issue itself. This could come from the prompt. Just don't copy it word for word. Put it in your own words. For rhetorical analysis, this could be the rhetorical situation. So like acknowledging who the writer or speaker is and like the event, things like that. but cut the fluff in the intro. You do not need a long intro. For some students, it really does help to plan their body paragraphs in advance. So a quick outline, like not huge detail, but like what are your main points going to be? And something that I told my students last year that helped a couple of them was for rhetorical analysis, I had them like write their main ideas out. So it'd be like a word or two. And I had them put a star by what they would call their home run paragraph. And that was because like I had students tell me like, oh, I ran out of time, but like my third body paragraph was going to be amazing. And I'm like, well, it doesn't help if you didn't write the third body paragraph. So they needed to know to pace, to write well enough to get to the points that they really wanted to make, if that makes sense. And I think it did help at least one of my students last year, because for the first time ever, I've taught her for 2 years, she didn't finish an essay. And this was like a huge shock for her because she always finished. So she wrote an intro, a very developed body paragraph, and then got like mostly through a second. She was freaking out because she was like, I didn't pass, and she was all upset. And last year we were able to read our students' essays after a certain point. So I looked at her essay and I was like, look, I think you made a 4 out of 6. I think it's going to be a 3 composite, not the end of the world. Here's why. Her one paragraph that was fully developed analyzed whatever choice she was talking about incredibly thoroughly and connected it to the rhetorical situation. For that rubric, that's all you have to do. So she knew where her like home run was. I don't know, there's probably a better metaphor, but you get the idea. And she prioritized. So if you feel like pacing is a struggle, have a plan and then know like what your deeper thoughts are, I guess, if that makes sense. So that way you don't leave the good stuff off. Like you want to make sure that you prove a point. As far as body paragraphs, you can write 2 body paragraphs. Sometimes students think that they have to write 3 and then they rush the body paragraphs. In my opinion, and this is just my opinion, but I do think I could support it with samples from the College Board. I would much rather see a student develop 2 body paragraphs than have 3 mediocre ones. So if you feel like your pacing is slow, that's okay as long as you're being thorough. But if you're the type of person who like writes something and then you like go back and second guess yourself, try not to do that too much. I've also seen students just like sit there and like they're thinking and thinking and thinking. Try to write something. But yeah, I would practice if you can this weekend. Just choose a prompt and like maybe try like a quick outline if that helps. Because I feel like whenever I would write an essay on a standardized test, if I had a plan, like if I could look at my notes and be like, oh yeah, I'm supposed to talk about this, it would help. How do I write a pre-outline quickly and effectively? So what I usually do is I have like, I'll put like main idea or like MI if you want to be like really abbreviated, and then put like whatever it is I'm supposed to talk about in that paragraph. And I might put like bullet points of like evidence or commentary, like thoughts I want to remember, and then I move on. So it's like not complete sentences. Sometimes it's shorthand, but it's just like little reminders. So hopefully that helps, but you're trying to like cut the fluff. Like you don't want a detailed outline, but it's more of like a roadmap that needs to make sense to you. My teacher wants us to do an open thesis, but I have, okay. I don't want to contradict your teacher, but a closed thesis is just fine for the exam. So do what works for you. If it's going to waste your time to try to think of an open thesis, then just make sure it's defensible. I guess like I would much rather you focus on your body paragraphs than a thesis. How can I organize my essay if the evidence of the devices is spread out? Okay, I think I understand what you're asking. So are you talking about like, say you want to analyze repetition and there's repetition in all the different parts, like beginning, middle, end. Analyze or whatever chronologically. I really like it when students break the passage up chronologically and divide it into sections. So they focus on the beginning, middle, and end, and ask yourself, okay, what's happening in the beginning? What's happening in the middle? What's happening in the end? As opposed to like going on a scavenger hunt of some sort. If that's not your usual approach and that's not how your brain works, don't necessarily do a complete overhaul. I did a video recently. I'm trying to think of the exact title. I did a plan with me video pretty recently where I walk through kind of like how I planned a paragraph. That one might help. I think that one's probably the most recent one that I could say, yeah, I go over some tips in that one. So that one might help as well. If you're a slow writer, but you type faster, should you do the digital? I don't know if you can at this point. Like, I don't know if you were supposed to have already declared that or not. I would talk to your AP teacher and see what the possibilities are. Because I know that we had a student in our school who, for like a reason, had to take the digital test, and like our coordinator was like super stressed about having to like change it from paper to digital. So I don't know if like you already had to declare that or not. I don't know if it's an option. So definitely talk to either your AP teacher or your AP coordinator, because I could see how it might benefit you, but I don't want to mislead you and tell you, oh, sure, do that, because I don't know if it's possible. How many paragraphs do you recommend we write for each of the 3 essays? At least 2 body paragraphs if possible. You technically do not need a conclusion, though it can help. If you can go for 3, go for 3, but quality is more important. I feel like when you see the prompt and you kind of figure out your main ideas, you'll know whether you're going to go for 2 or 3. At least that's what my students have said. Like, a lot of my students this year really only can write 2 body paragraphs, usually for rhetorical analysis, but I think it applies to all the essays. So even when I've pushed them to try to plan for 3 paragraphs, they're like, but on the exam, I would only do 2. And I'm like, okay, fine. So development matters more. We don't want to like underdevelop just for the sake of more paragraphs. So for me personally, when I've like done practice essays with my students, there are some prompts where I very clearly could write 3 body paragraphs. I might not get to a conclusion, but I could write 3 body paragraphs. There are other prompts where I'm like, it's 2, but then I would try for a conclusion if I had time. So I think it's kind of like a personal thing, but like I said, the development to me is the most important. If I use historical evidence, should I avoid things like the American Revolution? Oh, okay. Trying to stay away from basic examples. Yes and no. I would say, because there are some things over the years where I'm like, okay, yeah, everybody wrote about that. Well, not everybody literally, but you know the idea. If you're going to write about something like the American Revolution, first of all, don't assume that your reader knows what you're talking about. And what I mean is, like, I've read essays where students were talking about like the Stamp Act or something, and they'll be like, oh yeah, the Stamp Act. And then they'll just like keep talking, but never define what the Stamp Act was. Now, do I know what the Stamp Act is? Yes, but like, don't assume that your reader knows. So use, it's like in a positive phrase or a non-restrictive clause, like put like the Stamp Act, comma, an act in which blah, 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 blah. I think it was when they like taxed paper goods, but I could be totally wrong. Like, tell your reader what it is, because that helps your credibility and it helps create that line of reasoning. Like, don't make the reader guess, because the reader cannot infer or assume. We have to look at what's on the page. So if you're going to use an example that's more common or that you think is more common, just make sure you're being specific, because in like the heat of the moment, when you're taking the test, that might be all you can think about. So I wouldn't say shy away from it, but if you can choose maybe a less obvious example that's still equally as good, that could be better. But at the end of the day, for argument, you have to be convincing and specific. So if that means writing about the American Revolution, the American Revolution is kind of a broad topic, but so like I would ask like, okay, what part of the American Revolution? Boston Tea Party, Stamp Act, signing of the Declaration of Independence, like narrow it down a little bit more than that, because like saying like the Civil Rights Movement or World War II, that's too broad. So narrow it down more than just American Revolution, but could you write about it? Yeah, sure. Let's see. Really good advice. Well, thank you. I try. How should I prepare for grammar related content? Okay, so there are some questions on like the multiple choice that are sort of grammar related, but like they're not going to ask you about like commas and semicolons like the SAT does. Like, it's not like that kind of question. So if you're looking at SAT release tests, the writing and language portion, look at the questions that have a question stem. So what that means is like they have an actual question above it, not just the ones that are answers. Because those are more like what the College Board asks for AP Lang. And it's more about like, should they combine these sentences? Like, how do we combine them effectively? or should they add this or delete this? So those are the ones that are more likely to be on there. You're not really going to be asked one where it's like a comma splice or something. So if you haven't been taught grammar in a while, look at the SAT test as like a guide, but look at the ones that have a question above it, and that might help. Is a response to a possible rebuttal to your claim necessary to add? Okay, no. So I think you mean for argument or maybe synthesis as well. Like, do you have to address the counter argument and then refute it? No, you don't. In fact, like I've seen a lot of essays where students did that and like it didn't actually help their argument because it was kind of blah. So my advice would be, if you have time for it and you can do it well, then yes, because it can be a way to further your argument. But if you can't think of one that's going to work, then I wouldn't stress about it. It's not required. It is a technique to use, but it's not required. Do you think it's better to have 3 evidence paragraphs for the argument or 2 paragraphs or pieces of evidence? Okay, so if we're talking about like evidence per paragraph, usually I encourage my students to have at least 2 layers, meaning like we don't want just like one piece of evidence. We want to try to create some more development. I have seen students do 3 successfully, like 3 layers, but it really just depends on the paragraph and the student. So if I'm understanding your question correctly, then I would say like 2 is kind of like the average, but if you can go for 3 and it works for you, that's okay. Are dates and years added in the documents, or do you have to know? Okay, so for rhetorical analysis, they should tell you the year of the passage, either in the prompt itself or like sometimes for letters, if they're like really old letters, it'll be like at the top of the letter. So they should tell you when it's from, because yeah, you do need to know that. It's part of the rhetorical situation. They should provide that for you. Now in the multiple choice, they might not give you the year. They might just say like 19th century, but they should provide that. And then for the synthesis, they give you like the source information as well if you need that. But yeah, any of that info should be provided if you're supposed to know it. Like the College Board does a good job about like giving you all the definitions and like stuff you need, like to be fair, because everybody has a different starting point. So that stuff should be provided. Let's see. How do you earn the point in row C? Okay, so sophistication. I have videos on this for rhetorical analysis and synthesis. I don't think I've done one for argument yet. Choose like one thing you want to focus on and go for it. So if you have a good writing style, maybe practice that. If you're good at situating it in a broader context, work on that. Or for rhetorical analysis, really examining like the tensions of the rhetorical situation. So there's different ways to earn it. And technically you only have to do one, but a lot of the essays where I've read and I'm like, okay, like a student of mine who wrote it, I'm like, okay, I definitely think this earned the sophistication point. They actually did like 2 of the 3, which made me more sure. So if you're curious about like what they're looking for, I would look at the released samples from 2018 and 2019 that have earned that point, because I think it's really helpful to see what the College Board considers sophisticated. And then I would also look at the ones that get like a 140. So they earned evidence and commentary, but it was not considered sophisticated, because I think that's a good way to kind of see, okay, this is what they want versus what they don't want. So yeah, that would be the sophistication point. How many sources of evidence do you need on the essays? Okay, so for the synthesis essay, that's the one where you have like usually 6 sources, though I think I read somewhere it says 6 to 8, but they've kind of been averaging 6. You need to cite 3 of the sources they provide, 3 different sources. Now, as far as like evidence in your other essays, like rhetorical analysis and argument, rhetorical analysis, you're working with 1 passage, but I recommend including like 2 to 3 pieces of evidence per paragraph. If you watch some of my videos where I demonstrate rhetorical analysis essays, I kind of go over that a little bit more, because like the phrase like piece of evidence is probably not super helpful. And then what I've noticed in like the release samples for question 3 is like a lot of the better scoring essays have like those 2 layers of evidence and commentary per paragraph. Like the person pairs examples together and examines them. So hopefully that answered your question. Is there a thing about being too specific for the evidence? I don't know that I've ever seen that. I've seen kids like over summarize before. Like I've seen kids kind of turn it into a history paper before. So you want to be brief if you're providing like background info. But I don't know that I've seen anyone be what I would consider too specific. I've seen people not get to their point, like not get to their commentary because they were so focused on the evidence. So I suppose that could happen. But I haven't really seen too specific. Just make sure you do get to that commentary though, and make sure that you're being concise if you're trying to fill people in on like background info. Can we jump from essay to essay? If you're taking the paper test, technically yes. If you're taking the digital test, my understanding is no. But the paper test, basically what will happen is when you start your essays, so if no one's told you guys this, you get like, they're like shrink wrapped, which is the first time I saw this, I thought it was really odd. But you have to like unwrap your essay packets, and there's like a packet that has the essay prompts in them for the paper test, and then like a booklet where you write your essays. So they're 2 separate documents or booklets. So the person who's administering your test has like this script that they have to read. And so they'll advise you like, time has begun, your 15-minute reading period has begun, or recommended reading period, however they phrase it. And they'll tell you when it's over, and they'll kind of cue you at different intervals. But I recommend, there should be a clock in the room, but if not, bring a watch if you like to keep track of time. It cannot be a smartwatch. It cannot be capable of texting, but it's like, it can be digital. It just can't receive text messages, or it can be like a plain watch. I didn't decide to do it this year, but like a couple of years ago, I went to Walmart and bought like $5 watches for a few of my students, like really cheap ones. Like, I think I got like Elsa and Groot and stuff because like it just needed to tell time. So you can pace yourself, and you can spend sort of like more or less than the recommended amount of time on any one essay. But when the total time is up, it's up. So if you finish early and want to go back to something on the paper test, you can. So if you intend to do that, leave yourself a little bit of room. But I've seen kids, at least in like in-class essays, like use like an asterisk and then go to like the end of their essay, or they've drawn arrows or written in the margin. They'll read what you write. So try to help your reader out, like as far as being clear on where stuff goes. But yeah, technically speaking, on the paper test, you can go back if you need to. Now digital, like I said, you can't, as far as I know. If we do a counterclaim, should we make it its own separate paragraph? Either method works. It just depends on, I think, your style and what you're trying to say. I've seen some kids incorporate it into a paragraph and it works well as like an extra layer. I've seen other kids do it as like a very developed paragraph, usually like paragraph 3. That also works. So it kind of depends on where you feel it fits best. It's a choice that you're going to make. There's not like a right or wrong way to do it. It just depends on where it fits. In the rhetorical essay, do we have to mention the small techniques such as metaphor? No. Okay, so yeah, you don't have to. So like, okay, this is going to get technical for a second. A metaphor is a device. So can you write about a metaphor? Yes. If there is one tiny metaphor, I wouldn't mention it unless there's a reason to. Now, if you're familiar with the Abigail Adams prompt, where she has like a whole metaphor about a river and a traveler, that one, I think you can look at that comparison a lot more and write like a whole paragraph about it. But sometimes I've seen kids notice a metaphor and then they try to write about it, but like there's not much to say. So when I teach this, I have my students divide the passage up into sections. And I have them tell me, okay, what is the writer or speaker doing? Like kind of like broad strokes, like zoom out. And then I ask them, how do you know he's doing that? And that's where they start to bring up those devices and like smaller choices that are working together in that section. So if that makes sense to you, that would be that approach. If you're like, I have zero clue what you're talking about, let me know and I could try to recommend certain videos of mine that demonstrate it. But like, you don't have to zero in on something super, super specific like that. A choice is simply what a writer is doing. So yeah, it can be more general. So yeah, I've seen it work really well when kids zoom out a little bit, but it's not wrong to start talking about like metaphors and allusions and things like that either. For a synthesis, if we're running low on time, should we do one body paragraph and then a counter argument, or just 2 body paragraphs? Okay, I really like this question. I'm trying to think of how best to answer it, because I would be more inclined to say 2 body paragraphs, because that would really prove your point more. But if you have a really convincing counter argument that you can refute, like a concession, refutation, counterclaim, and rebuttal, I would say go for it. I just feel like the whole point that they're trying to get you to do is develop a position. So I would say maybe the 2 body paragraph option would be better for that. And then you could do the counter argument instead of a conclusion, perhaps. But yeah, you really want to be proving your thesis. So I could just kind of see in some instances where if you did like 1 body and then the counter argument, I could kind of see that backfiring. So if I had to just on that information without seeing it executed, I would say 2 body paragraphs. For synthesis, do we only use the sources as evidence? Then for our commentary, do we need to explain how the evidence supports? Okay. Okay. So yes, like as in, okay, I'm trying to make sure I understand this correctly. You can, like, I've had students ask me, like, if I include personal evidence, can that be a source? No, it's extra, but you can't like make up a source. You have to use the sources provided, and you need to use at least 3 distinct sources. So you need to use 3 sources, and then your commentary, the way the College Board describes it is in fact what you just said there. It is explaining how the evidence supports your position or claim. I like to think of it as like either the why or the so what. So like you've included evidence. The commentary is when you explain why it matters. So what is it showing, demonstrating, illustrating? How does it affect society? Big picture, short-term, long-term, stuff like that. So I consider evidence the what, and then commentary is like either why or how, depending on how you want to think about it. Can students bring a highlighter or just pencil? You cannot bring a highlighter, unfortunately. You're going to need pencil for the multiple choice and then a pen for the essays if you're doing the paper test. The pen either needs to be blue or black ink. I would just make sure it's like a solid dark ink, because sometimes the blues are a little bit like lighter. Like a normal blue pen is fine, but like not like a gel pen or something. But yeah, now some schools, they do provide that for you, but you can't have highlighters, unfortunately. I wish you could. I don't know why. I don't know if they think someone could somehow cheat, but like I had a student once ask me if she could bring multiple shades of blue pens to use as highlighters. And I suppose that's like a loophole, but I told her I didn't think it was worth it. So yes, you need a pencil for multiple choice, and then blue or black ink pen for the essays. I would bring multiple in case you run out. Yes, you're supposed to use a pen to write your essays. Don't bring erasable pen. I don't even know if people really use those anymore, but just normal pen, blue or black ink. If you mess up, you can cross it out. If you draw like a strike through line through something, they won't read it. So I've seen kids like literally like scribble until it's like this big smudge that no one could ever read. That wastes time. Just cross it out. They won't read it if it's crossed out. The rhetorical techniques, logos, ethos, pathos. Okay, so yeah, the appeals are logos, ethos, and pathos, but there's a whole lot more that you could write about than just those things. So appeals are kind of separate than choices, but you could still write about logos, ethos, pathos. But yeah, you'd want to look up maybe some more like choices or devices as far as what the writer is doing, because choices actually create appeals. So for instance, if you know something's logical, ask yourself how you know. Is it because they're including like statistics or facts? I would focus on that. Like I would focus on the statistics or the facts and then explain why it's logical, as opposed to just saying it's logical. If it's an emotional appeal, usually it's imagery or like certain word choice. So specify which emotion. But yeah, if you notice an appeal, ask yourself what the writer is doing to create that appeal. And that will help you kind of broaden your analysis a little bit. Is it okay to have one piece of evidence per paragraph? I would advise against that. Obviously, there are exceptions. So I don't want to say it's a rule. But generally speaking, I find that essays are more successful when you have multiple pieces of evidence in each paragraph. Just because like it develops it more. So, but you also want to have commentary following the evidence. Would it be bad to separate the rhetorical analysis essay by rhetorical choices instead of doing it chronologically? No, I just don't know that it would score as highly, but if that's the method that works best for you, I believe you could still score at least a 4 out of 6 doing it that way. The key is to analyze at least one choice very thoroughly, regardless of whether or not you do it by device or choice or chronologically. So keep that in mind. Like one paragraph at least has got to be very thorough. I think the reason why I prefer a chronological analysis is because a passage has a line of reasoning. So whoever wrote the passage had a line of reasoning. If you analyze it chronologically, you're following their line of reasoning, which kind of helps you inherently have a better line of reasoning for your essay. So that's why I promote the chronological approach. But honestly, when I first started teaching, I didn't know to do that. So I just told kids to go buy the devices and they wrote essays that were just fine. So if you are not used to the chronological approach, I wouldn't necessarily change your method right now. Just be as thorough as possible. Because I know some teachers really hate like device-driven essays, but like technically speaking, if you're following what the rubric asks, then you're doing just fine. So I wouldn't panic about that. But do I teach chronological now? Yes. Have I had kids still do device-driven essays? Mm-hmm. And they were okay. Remember, these are a rough draft, guys. So like give yourselves a little bit of credit. As much as teachers like to say like, oh, don't do this, like you got 40 minutes. Like do what you can to be as successful as you can and then be proud of yourself. Okay, it looks like someone else is helping in the comments. That's very good. So if you guys have answers to these or tips, feel free to share advice as well. How in-depth should the commentary be for synthesis? As in-depth as you can make it, I guess. That's probably not a very helpful answer. I'm sorry. How many sentences would you recommend? Okay, so more commentary than evidence, at least 2 sentences. I had a student comment on my YouTube channel the other day that their teacher makes them write 4. I don't know that I could do 4 consistently all the time. I don't think it's as much about the number of sentences as it is about the quality of what you're writing. So really keep asking yourself, like, so what, why, that kind of stuff. Like, why does this matter? Who does it benefit? Like that kind of stuff to develop the commentary. But as far as like the number of sentences, I would say if you had to come up with a number, at least 2, maybe 3 if possible. But it's more about the quality there. But yeah, if you want to make the commentary as in-depth as you can at that point. In your opinion, are prep books such as Barron's identical? No, they're not. I don't think so. So when I first started teaching AP Lang, I bought like every test prep book there was, and I didn't find them super helpful. When I'm using materials in my classroom, I either create my own, which I'm not good at multiple choice. So I'm good at, not good, I guess. I don't want to like sound conceited, but I like creating essay prompts for rhetorical analysis. But I don't create my own multiple choice. I will use the stuff from the College Board, specifically like the SAT if I'm looking for multiple choice. I don't think the test prep books are bad, but like I just think they're imitating the test. They're not from the real creators. And I actually did write an ebook recently about rhetorical analysis where I kind of created my own like step-by-step approach. I noticed that some of the test prep books weren't very thorough with what they were talking about because they were trying to tackle like every element of the test. So I just focused on rhetorical analysis. So if you're curious about my ebook, it's like 50, 60 pages. I can give you the link, but I don't know. But like, should you rely on them? If you've bought them and you want to use them, like if you have Barron's, Princeton Review, sure, but like I've had students like get super stressed out because they're like, I don't understand the answer. I'm doing worse than I did it on like the College Board stuff. So if it's going to add stress to your life, I would say don't bother. If it helps you feel more prepared, then I would say go for it. But are they incredibly accurate? In my opinion, no. They're close, but they're not super accurate. Or not perfectly accurate, I should say. There aren't any official release practice tests. All right. So, okay, this is where it's frustrating as a student because teachers, we have access to 3 release tests through AP Classroom. So your teacher can assign you a practice test. But like you as a student, I don't think have access to anything more than the questions in what's called the course exam description. So if you wanted access to more stuff on AP Classroom, technically your teacher can assign it, I believe, to just certain students. And it should like auto score most of it. So maybe if you have a good relationship with your teacher, just ask like, hey, would you mind if just assigning this to me if that's something you want? If you want the course exam description, type in, like when you Google, type in AP Lang course exam description. It's going to bring up this really big, boring document. It's like a PDF of like 150, 200 pages. Scroll to almost the very end. You'll see one set of a sample reading passage with some questions and one of a writing passage. So it's like 17 questions total. The answer key is a couple pages after that. Not the best practice, but it is a really good starting point. Is it okay to write 2 body paragraphs? Yes. Yes, it is. Sometimes that's all you can do. So I wouldn't stress about it. Just be thorough. Can you get a 5 without getting the sophistication point? Yes, because it's all, so I don't know the exact formula they're going to use, but the multiple choice is worth like 1 point each because there are 45 questions. It's 45% of your composite. When we do our mock exam, we take the students' essay scores and we multiply it by, it's something like 3.056 or 56. There's like this decimal that we use in our state. And that seems to be pretty close. What we don't know exactly yet, and I don't know if we'll really truly ever know because it kind of varies from year to year, is like, so once you add all those possible points together out of the maximum, we don't know where the breakdowns are. But I don't believe that you need like a perfect score on all your essays to get a 5 because it's a range. So if I were trying to get a 5, this is hypothetical here because I don't have all the info I would need to be certain, but I would say probably at least 70% on multiple choice to be comfortable, and like averaging 5s out of 6s on the essay. Then I think that might be like that might put you in contention there. It's either a high 4 or a low 5, but that's just a guess. Let's see. I was about to watch your sophistication videos, but could you explain? I would recommend you watch the videos simply because I feel like I do a better job explaining it in my videos than I do in person because I like can pause in my videos and like plan them out ahead of time. So they're probably better quality than me live. But basically there are different methods. Vivid descriptive writing style. To me, for my students, that's the least common. Very, very rarely do they earn it for that reason. Situating it in a broader context, that's where most of my students are more successful if they are attempting it. But again, like they can try it. And if they don't get it, it at least helps their commentary. And then depending on the essay, a really good counterclaim and rebuttal, like really good, can help, or just like examining the tensions within their essay. So those are kind of like the ways you can earn it. But if you want like specific tips, hopefully that video would help. How can I prepare for the multiple choice? If you're looking for practice questions, use the SAT reading, not the fiction passage. Ignore the questions that ask about like the best evidence and ignore the questions that have a chart because your multiple choice won't have a chart. But if you want like exposure to questions, there is like each SAT practice test has the multiple choice, and then in a separate document has the answers. And usually their explanations are pretty good. So that would be one way. And then if you're looking for a practice with the writing multiple choice, I would go to the SAT writing and language questions. Look at the questions that have a question above the answer choices, not just the ones that have like answer choices and no question. So if you want exposure, if you just want to practice, that's as close as you can get, I think, because the College Board makes the SAT. Could you give any tips on how to avoid the distracting answer? So usually the distractor is like, I'm trying to think, like it's usually like a misinterpretation of the passage or something. So like if it's hard to explain. Like multiple choice is like the thing that I find most frustrating to teach, because like while I could probably answer the question, having to explain it is sometimes a little bit hard. And like I probably wouldn't make a perfect score. Like if you guys gave me 45 multiple choice, I don't think I'd make a 45 out of 45. So if you're struggling with multiple choice, just know it's okay. You're not expected to make a perfect score. But what I have seen them do is kind of like latch on to like a really specific part of the passage, or it's like in the wrong section or something, and that's a distractor. Or they like misinterpret the passage, and that's a distractor. Like they might use words from the passage, but like not correctly, that kind of stuff. I haven't watched the video, but I know that Tim Freitas from Garden of English did a video about multiple choice distractors. So if you want more detail on that, he might be a better source of information than I could be. But if you know it's a distractor, don't even consider it, just eliminate it. Because like each set of 5 answer choices has, you know, a couple throwaway answers and at least one distractor. And usually it comes down to the wording of the answer choice. Is it okay to write 2 body paragraphs? Yes. Is the conclusion necessary? Technically, no, it's not in the rubric. Some teachers prefer that you have one, but a lot of times what I see is like if students run out of time, they might do like a 1-sentence conclusion. Sometimes those fall really flat. So if you have time for a conclusion, make it meaningful. So what that looks like depends on the essay, but for like rhetorical analysis, you might examine like the effectiveness, or you might try to situate it in a broader context historically, depending on the passage. For like synthesis, you might ask yourself like, okay, what happens if we make these changes or whatever, and then what happens if we don't, like looking at like big picture societal stuff. For argument, it might be kind of like looking at like the deeper message there as far as your argument. So if you have time for a conclusion, I would say go for it. But if you have to decide between writing a stronger body paragraph or a conclusion, I would choose the body paragraph because of how row B, evidence and commentary, is worded. So are they necessary? No. And I know plenty of students don't get to their conclusion. I'm a self-studier and I've been doing really bad at multiple choice section on Barron's. I actually tutor some students, and I just before this like live, I was just tutoring a student who bought the Barron's book, and she scored way worse on Barron's than Princeton Review. And she was really upset. So I've never looked at the Barron's text, to be honest. Like she just did this on her own to self-study. And I don't know, like I don't want to trash Barron's, but like you're the second person I've heard that has said they didn't do well on Barron's. And like I would not dwell on that. Like you're a smart person, you're going to rock your test. They just might not have very quality questions. So yeah, like if you're using a test prep book, like, you know, don't like think it's going to be indicative of your test. Like don't think you're going to bomb it just because you didn't do well on that one part. Now, if you're doing amazing, then I don't want to deter you. But like sometimes we look for like patterns. Like I've had students take a mock exam and not do well, and they're like, oh my God, I'm going to fail the test. And then like they did just fine. So like, you know, studying is good, but like what happens on exam day is so different. So don't convince yourself that you're not good enough or something. Not that you were, but that was more of a pep talk for everybody else. Let's see. Can I put 2 sources in conversation when one negates? Yeah, you can. That's a good question. So I believe you're talking about for synthesis. So if there's one source, like I'm thinking of the wind farm prompt, for example, one source said that wind farms caused like medical problems. And then like another source was like, no, they don't. And then one source said like, it's really bad for the animals. And then another source was like, no, they're not. So if you see opposites like that, then yeah, you can decide which side you agree with, and you can kind of use that as like your counter argument and stuff. So yeah, you can absolutely put them in conversation because they contradict. Though I have seen some prompts on the AP Classroom where like that wasn't possible based on what they gave you. But like, yeah, if you can do it, that's fine. So we can look for conversation means, to me at least, similarities, differences, like adding on to something, like expanding. Like, so when we say conversation of sources, what we mean is like when you're having a conversation, let's say with like friends or family, you don't just summarize what they say. That's not a conversation. It doesn't go anywhere. So what you do is you might agree with them and explain why. You might disagree with somebody and explain why. You might take a point that they've given you and build on it. So that's what we mean by conversation, is like those different techniques. So yeah, you can absolutely put them in conversation if they negate each other. Just like I would say, you probably need to choose which side you're on. So you're like favoring one and refuting the other. But yeah. Okay, so please be aware of the publication dates and prep books. Yeah, the exam was modified. So like 2020 was supposed to be the first year that this was like the new test. So they came up with like the course exam description stuff in 2019. If you're using an older prep book, some of the questions are not going to be right. Also, shout out to Marco Learning. Someone brought this up in the chat. They do have some test prep resources that are pretty good and they're free. I do think you need to usually give them your email address, but that's not a big deal in my opinion. And they do a lot of test prep stuff too. So if you're looking for more stuff, I should have mentioned that earlier, but Marco Learning, they work really hard to help students as well. Maybe I can partner with them someday. Who knows? Okay, so for the grading, is it like the SAT where incorrect questions don't affect your score? Correct. So like there's no penalty for guessing. So if you get it wrong, it's not like, it's more about like how many you get right out of 45. It's not like if you get it wrong, it hurts you. And what I mean is like you should try to fill in every answer, even if it's a guess. So I tell my students, if they struggle with pacing, the last like 2 minutes of the hour, if they still have questions left, just choose a letter and bubble it in. A lot of students think C is the most popular. I've heard that that's not true. I've heard it's either A or D. I don't make a pattern. Like don't try to like make a zigzag or something. Literally just choose one letter and bubble it in. And then if you have time to change maybe one, if you're like, oh, I know this answer, then fine, but don't leave any questions blank for multiple choice on the paper test. I would say the same for digital, but remember digital, you can't go backwards. So that's like kind of a wrinkle, but like, yeah, please don't leave any questions blank. It is better to guess and be wrong than to like not be eligible at all. Because if you have 5 answer choices and you guess, you have a 20% chance of getting it right, even if it's a complete blind guess where you're just putting down a letter. But yeah, choose one letter and go for it. If you notice that you've barely used a certain letter, but you're pretty confident in your answers, then maybe choose that letter. But I don't know that you'd really have time to notice that with 2 minutes left. So just choose a letter and move on. But yes, bubble in everything. Do you recommend spending time on the intro, or should I just write a thesis and move on? I recommend don't be fluffy with your intro. So I prefer to see from my own students, if possible, a couple sentences of context and then a thesis. So like a 2 or 3 sentence intro, something quick. These long-winded intros really don't help you in terms of the rubric. If you cannot think of anything to say before your thesis, just write a thesis that's defensible and move on. Don't waste time on the intro. But yeah, if you can do a little bit more than 1 sentence, go for it. Let's see. Can you go over how to format an argumentative essay? Like how specific should our evidence be and in-depth? Okay, so the prompt asks for specific evidence. So you want to, I'm trying to think of like an example of something that would be somewhat specific versus specific. I think the key is like making sure it's clear who the person is if you're talking about a person or an event. So let's say you're talking about, I gave this example earlier in the talk, but like the Stamp Act. If you just start talking about the Stamp Act and don't tell me what it actually is, then that's not really helpful to the person reading your essay. But if you could define it like very briefly, like the Stamp Act, comma, and tell me what it is and then finish your sentence, that helps. Specific evidence increases your credibility. So I would say it's important to favor that specific evidence. As far as what that looks like, I'm a very visual person. So if I were studying for the exam, what I would do is I would go to the College Board's essays that they rescored from 2018 and 2019. And I would read essays that got a 120. So they didn't have specific evidence. It was just somewhat specific. And then I would look at like a 130 to see what that difference is. And then also a 140 to see like the difference between having specific evidence, but maybe not so great commentary versus specific evidence with good commentary. So I'm very visual. So if I see something, it helps it click more. So if you're also kind of a visual person that likes models, then definitely look at the College Board sample essays. And those are available online. You want the ones that have been rescored on the 6-point rubric. So they're going to be typed. They're not going to be handwritten. I think they still have some of the handwritten ones up, but go for the typed ones. I'm nervous for multiple choice. Do you have any tips or advice? Don't linger too long on any one question. Eliminate answer choices that you know are wrong. One tip for the paper testers that helped me personally, but might not work for everybody, is I like to read the questions in advance and then go look at the passage. This does not work for everybody. I've had some students tell me that it totally screws them up, but I like to know what I'm supposed to be looking for because you're not reading for pleasure. If you can practice kind of like skimming or speed reading or something, that can help. Another tip is like if the passage is really dense, sometimes writing like the main idea, like if the passage, if like the paragraph rather is about like, I don't know, like disobedience or something, like writing like a quick note in the margin if you can, just to like kind of remember what the main idea was. Also, if they give you like, and I hope they don't, but if they do, they give you like a really, really old passage from like 1800s or something. Sometimes those writers like just did not paragraph the way we do now. So if it's like this huge chunk of text, for whatever reason, add in like break points for yourself to make sure that it's like a comprehension check. So like, cause it can be really hard to just read like this chunk of text with no paragraph breaks. So give yourself time to pause and be like, oh, okay, this is what they've said. And then I would maybe put like a bullet point in the margin and then move on. So you can actually like pause as needed. So those would be just some general tips. I did address some others in like earlier parts, but I am curious for those of you who are like here watching, if you have tips for multiple choice that work for you, go ahead and put them in the chat, because like I don't necessarily take a ton of multiple choice tests with my students. I do write essays with them sometimes. So like if there's something that works for you that as a teacher I don't know about, I would love to hear it so I could give better advice. Let's see. Okay, so someone did give some advice. Look at the questions first. Okay, that's what I did. I didn't know to do that in high school, but in like college, I somehow figured that out. It worked a lot better for me. But for digital test takers, you can't do that because you can't move forward and backward, which is kind of unfortunate. And okay, this person brought up a good point. So thank you. Is mayonnaise an instrument? Nice name. They're all in chronological order too. So that helps you as you're going through stuff. I'm nervous for argument and rhetorical analysis. Yeah, it's okay to be nervous. Everybody has different strengths. So what I would recommend doing is try to figure out like 1 or 2 things to work on before test day. So what is it about argument that makes you nervous? Or what is it about rhetorical analysis that makes you nervous? And then focus on understanding that one part better. So if we just say like, oh, how can I write a better rhetorical analysis essay? I can give you some tips. In fact, I do have a couple of days ago, I posted 5 tips for a better rhetorical analysis essay. Earlier today, I did 5 tips for synthesis. 5 tips for argument is coming. So like I can give you tips, but if you want to know a certain skill, that could be a more targeted way to study. So just something to consider. For question 1, they will not ask you what the call to action is. Okay. I think that might be in response to somebody else. I'm not totally sure what that means out of context, but if you could clarify if you're like responding to someone, that'd be really helpful, because I'm not sure if it's something that I said or if somebody was asking in the chat. Okay, so someone said, I'm confused as to why people are nervous. They don't look hard. I think the biggest thing that makes students really nervous is the timing, and also the fact that it's a cold read, because like you're just seeing the prompt on exam day. That can, especially if it's a prompt that you're like, oh my goodness, that can be really scary. So if that happens to you where you have a moment of panic, breathe. And remind yourself of the rubric and the task at hand. What are you supposed to do? And then just do those things as well as you can. But yeah, some people are just naturally good at test taking. Other people are not. Some people are good at writing. Others are not. So like, if you're nervous, that is perfectly valid and it's okay. And I would focus on like what you can do to make yourself more comfortable. If you are not nervous, don't get nervous just because other people are. It just depends. So the multiple choice is identical to SAT reading, not quite identical, but close. Like, if you want practice with the AP line reading, I would say looking at SAT reading can help, because that was made by the College Board. Just look at the nonfiction passages, or Marco Learning has good resources as well. Out of all the test prep companies, I feel like they're most attuned with like what's actually on the test. And they have more current stuff than some of these other ones. Let's see. Are there any tips to obtain evidence? Okay, yeah, that's one of the biggest things that people question about is like how do I get evidence for argument? So my advice is to play to your strengths. Even if you're not in like an AP US history class, but you're just in like American history or something, chances are you've learned about different movements, different like people. So you might be able to brush up on those in case it fits your prompt. Now, it might not fit your prompt, but I would say if you're like broad strokes here, if you could brush up on important historical figures who've like been involved in like progress or change or something, that could help you. Knowing about a couple different movements in history or wars or major events could help you. Current events, honestly, I don't know. I mean, all of you probably have some experience with COVID in some way. So that would be it. I've had students in the past have some really unique interests though. And they were able to use that to their advantage. So like I had a student who was really good at softball, and she was actually able to use softball and some of her essays, either personal experience or just like knowledge of like the sport in general, depending on the prompt. Same with soccer. I've had students who are musicians or really interested in science, know about different famous people, or like if they weren't musicians, but like they had a favorite band or something, they could maybe use that. So like go with what you know that fits the prompt. My biggest fear as a teacher is that because the 2019 prompt about something being overrated was like very different in my opinion than previous years, I'm worried there's going to be more of like one like that. And I find that type harder. If I were writing the essay, I would find it harder. But remember, at the end of the day, you just have to have a logical argument. So make a claim and prove it as specifically as you can. I'm not trying to like intimidate you guys. I'm just saying like as teachers, we have worries too. That would help. And yeah, a lot of people say that they struggle with choosing evidence. So sometimes it helps to just write your ideas down and then see if there's any like commonalities, like common threads and that kind of stuff. Like I'm a visual person. So if I write down all of the ideas that come to mind, then writing one idea down might help me come up with better ideas. And I can say, okay, like these two things are related. I can put them in one paragraph. And it doesn't have to be the same category. You could take like, I don't know, like a famous band and then personal experience. If you are a musician, pair those together. You can put two different examples from history together. So history, current events, whatever you want to do. But sometimes having like a list, brainstorming, and then choosing which evidence belongs in your essay, sometimes that really helps. I did 2 practice exams and got a 25 out of 45 on both. I'm aiming for a 4. What should I do? Okay, so 25 out of 45 isn't bad, but I would say if you did that multiple choice score and wrote 4 out of 6s on your essay, you'd be more inclined for a 3. So I would, if you're aiming for a 4, and this is just best guess, I don't have concrete info to prove this. I would say aiming for like 60 to 70% correct on multiple choice and at least 4s, if not maybe 1.5 on your essay could help for a 4 composite. Again, like there's kind of these ranges. So it's hard for me to give you an exact number because there's multiple factors going on. But if for my own students, like if you were my student and you said, I'm making 25 out of 45 and I'm writing 4 out of 6s on my essay, what's my composite most likely going to be? I would tell you a 3. And a 3 is not bad, but if you're aiming for a 4, then now maybe you do stronger on your essays. Maybe you're a 5 out of 6 consistently, in which case that could help. But based on that, I would say try to get it closer to like 30 or 35 out of 45 if possible. That might be too big of a jump. But just like any little bit counts because it's all kind of like a mathematical game at the end. Is there any way to lower the nervous or stress level? Okay, I don't know. I dealt with a lot of like anxiety in high school in different ways. So I don't want to like assume that my experience is everybody's experience. But things that helped me were positive self-talk, which means like literally telling yourself you can do this. It was really hard for me sometimes to like, if I had a moment of panic, it was like the world was over. So I had to remind myself that my score does not define me. And I had to remind myself that, you know what, I was prepared. And if it was hard for me, it was going to be hard for other people too. So I think keep that in mind. And then I think hopefully you have like the ability to just say like, I'm going to do it. I'm going to nail it. I've had kids come out of the exam in the past and be like, I failed it and they did just fine. So if the exam is hard, just know it's not just hard for you. And the College Board takes the difficulty into consideration. As far as how it's called norming the test, there's math involved. I'm not a math person. I don't work for the College Board, so I don't get this insider info. But like they will score it fairly. So if it's a harder passage or harder prompt, just know that like you're not alone in thinking that it's hard. But also like just control what you can control. So write as much as you can and give it your best effort. But don't let like the negative thoughts creep in if at all possible. Now I know that's harder, so, like more said than done, but also if you're taking the paper test and one like certain essay is like really stressing you out, I would still want you to write that essay, but maybe save it for last. Especially if you think you're going to do better at like another essay, play to your strengths in that way too. Does the evidence for the argument essay have to relate to each other? Like, for example, would it be fine if I use historical evidence? And yeah, you can. And there has to be some kind of common theme, but like, they don't have to be from the same category. So I've had students partner like historical evidence and current events because there was some kind of like connectedness there. I've had students do like a famous sports figure and their personal experience, and it worked just fine. Now the transitions will be important. So like kind of transitioning from one to the other within a paragraph helps the flow of the essay. So you could say something like, if it was like going from historical to current events, you could say, you know, this isn't just a past phenomenon. It happens in modern times as well. Or if you did the current events first, you could say this isn't just a recent phenomenon, it's happened in the past too. Or if you're doing like famous person and then you could say like, you know, this experience is not just exclusive to said person. It's happened to me. Like, I can't really tell you exactly, but like you can transition well. Or like kind of indicate to your reader, hey, we're moving on here. So there's a similarity that I want to show you. So let me take you from layer 1 of evidence to layer 2. So yeah, definitely doesn't have to be the same like category, but guide your reader as to why you're switching topics. But yeah, that can actually be more meaningful if you can show it like in different areas. Now, if you want to put 2 science examples together, go for it. That's okay too. Let's see. How do I read the passages faster? Do you mean for multiple choice or rhetorical analysis? I guess it doesn't totally matter, but if you can practice like speed reading somehow, that might help. If you are like, one tip that I've heard people say is to read like the topic sentences and concluding sentences of paragraphs to get the gist. If that was the rhetorical analysis essay, I wouldn't do that though. But if you're just trying to skim for like synthesis, that could be something like read, like I've heard people say either read the topic sentence and concluding sentence of each paragraph, or like read the first paragraph and like the topic sentences of the middle ones and then the last paragraph. I would practice this though before exam day, but for synthesis, getting the gist of the source can help in that regard. And also just like not going back and rereading stuff can help, but I know sometimes you kind of have to, but just kind of noting, okay, this is what they're talking about and move on can help. But yeah, try maybe some of those techniques and see if they help you. But I would practice them before exam day, because you don't want to try something on exam day that's totally new if you can avoid it. I heard from my teacher that personal experience isn't great. This is like an older thought process. When I first started teaching, people were like, no personal experience. And then with the 9-point rubric, it didn't really benefit you to have personal experience in a lot of cases. In the wording of some of the College Board prompts, they use the word experience. So I don't want to contradict another teacher. But if you have compelling personal experience that helps move your argument forward, go for it. It has to be meaningful. All your evidence has to be meaningful in some way. So there's times when it's easier to talk about personal experience than something else, but I've also seen it kind of backfire too. So ask yourself, is it truly helping me prove my point? Why am I including this personal experience? Does it show personal growth or change? Because if that's the case, then I would say it would be worth it. But like, should you automatically include personal experience? No, it's not a rule that you should or shouldn't. It's what's best for your argument. I did do a video on this on my channel. So if you look for a video about how to write about personal experience, I give some examples of how to do it and some other tips. So yeah, but there definitely was a time in my teaching career where a lot of people said, don't do it. And I think honestly, it was because of the old rubric and stuff like that, but things have changed a little bit. So it's not that you can't, it's just that you want to make sure it's valuable. Let's see. Sorry, I appreciate you guys helping each other in the chat to give each other support and answers. I'm trying to find some of the questions. During the 15-minute reading period, should we just focus on synthesis or read rhetorical analysis as well? Okay, great question. If it were me, and this is just what I would recommend, is I would try to spend 10 minutes if possible on the synthesis sources. You can start writing during the reading period. So if you decide I'm doing synthesis first, I would maybe try not to use all 15 minutes for the reading of the synthesis sources if possible. And then, so you would kind of bank those 5 minutes. So I'd spend 40 minutes writing the essay, and then I would have those 5 minutes for rhetorical analysis. Because on the paper test, at least, it's kind of like rolling time. So they're going to cue you at certain points to tell you, hey, this is how much time has passed, but you can manipulate that time. Everybody gets the exact same number of minutes, but how you divide it up is up to you. So what I would say, though, is I wouldn't read the synthesis sources and then go read rhetorical analysis and then write an essay, because I personally wouldn't remember what I had said or read or thought. So I would answer one prompt at a time. And a lot of students do start with the synthesis essay because it's like the biggest one. I also have a theory that that's why it's usually the highest score, is because students spend the most time on it and they do it first, but I can't really prove that. So yeah, I would say some students, they do better just by spending 10 minutes on it. If you need the 15, then go for it. But just know that once the 15 minutes is up, it's 40 minutes per essay is what they recommend. And I personally like to have about 45 for rhetorical analysis. So I would get those 5 minutes from the reading period. I would spend a little bit less time on synthesis, just personal preference. If you want to practice this, Find 2 prompts, like a synthesis and rhetorical analysis prompt, that are hopefully pretty current that you haven't done. If you've got time this weekend, time yourself, see how it goes. And for the paper test, technically you don't have to answer them in order of 1, 2, 3. If you're taking the digital test, your question 1 is not going to be synthesis. They have a different order. So for the paper test, you can answer the questions in whichever order you want. And I do have some students that in the past have played to their strengths. So they might not write it in the order of synthesis, rhetorical analysis, argument, because they need more time with one or the other, or they're like, yeah, that one prompt was not going to be good anyway, so I just saved it for last or something. So all personal choices, but that's just kind of what I would recommend. Okay, so do you recommend memorizing devices for the multiple choice? They have said they're not going to use terms-based questions anymore, but I heard from another AP Lit teacher that her students said that there were some on the AP Lit test. I don't have like a list of terms that I have students memorize. I do think there's a few terms you should know, like the word exigence. That's kind of new. That's like the impetus or the catalyst, meaning like what prompted them to write. I've seen that in some of the questions on AP Classroom. And if you don't know what that word means, it could be hard to answer the question. I would say it's important to know words like to concede, like a concession, things like that. But I don't have this big list that I have students memorize. Now, there are lists out there on the internet. If you want to look at them, you can, but it seems like they're trying to make more of an effort of, instead of using like a literary device in the answer choice, to just like describe what's happening in plain language, which is very helpful to students. So I would say you don't need to really memorize a big long list of stuff. No, just personal opinion. But if that would make you feel more prepared, then go for it. Yeah, digital test, you can't look backwards on questions. You can only like move forward. Kind of unfortunate, but I kind of understand why they're doing it. So yeah, my students are taking the paper test. I have one student doing a digital test. So like literally for me mentally, I'm like focusing on paper test and then digital later. So if I seem to be talking about the paper test, it's because it's the one that's coming up. But I will try to answer questions about the digital test too. It's just, they're slightly different, even though you guys are doing the same stuff, it's like a different order. So that's kind of stressful, I think, for students. Can you give tips about the complexity or sophistication point? I've mentioned it a few times previously in this live. I do have a couple of videos on it as well, addressing it. I know I have one for rhetorical analysis and one for synthesis. I don't think I actually did it for argument yet, but my best tips are in those videos. So I would recommend that. Does the rhetorical analysis not count towards the 15 minutes? No, okay. So let me make sure I'm explaining this clearly. You get 15 minutes as a recommended reading period where you can do whatever you want. It used to be that you couldn't write during that time, apparently, but now you can. So basically you have 2 hours and 15 minutes to read and write. So a lot of students spend the 15 minutes doing synthesis, like prepping for that. But then if you do that, you've only got 40 left. Now you don't have to spend exactly 40 minutes on all those essays, but that's how it breaks up. So that's why I said, like, if it were me, I would do like 10 for synthesis planning and reading. I'd write my synthesis and then I would give myself those 5 extra minutes of the 15. I would like bank it for rhetorical analysis, if that makes sense. Hopefully I'm explaining that clearly, but you get total 2 hours and 15 minutes to do everything you need to do. Is there any last minute tips to do well on prove on? Okay. I am working on some videos. I've released 2 of them. 5 tips for synthesis came out earlier today. 5 tips for rhetorical analysis I did earlier. I'll do the argument one tomorrow. So if you want like a crash course, those videos might be helpful, as well as other content. Another way to prepare would be, if you are like a visual person, to look at the released essays from the College Board that have been rescored and kind of see like what they recommend for those essays, like what they liked and didn't like, so to speak, like why it got the score that it did. But I would be very targeted with your studying. If it were me, like I would choose like either one element of each essay that you want to focus on, or maybe just one essay in general. Because if you try to conquer all the things, yes, you guys still have it. Now, this is if you're taking the test on Wednesday. If you're taking the test for digital, then you have more time. But the idea is like, if you try to do all the things before Wednesday, you're throwing a bunch of darts at a dartboard and they might not stick. So I would be more precise and figure out where your weaknesses are and how to improve, as opposed to just trying to cover all the things, which is my personal opinion. Yes, thank you to those who are answering questions in the chat. That really helps me out. And thank you guys for joining me tonight and giving up a portion of your Saturday to do this. Hopefully the tips are helpful. Can you give a few examples of rhetorical choices? Yes. Okay, so you're confused about a choice in a device. You and a bunch of students and teachers are too. So here's the way I think of it. A device is usually a noun. A choice is usually a verb. Can you write about devices in your essay? Technically, yes. Do teachers prefer that? Not always. But a device would be like metaphor. The choice would just be compares. So just a little distinction there. But as far as the choices or devices that I see most frequently in passages, I did a video on this last year. It was something like, which choices do you really need to know? It's good to know the appeals, logos, ethos, pathos. Don't actually call them logos, ethos, pathos. Call them by the English words. So logic, emotions, tell which emotion, credibility, or ethics, depending on which one you're talking about. But remember that choices create appeals. So if you see something that's logical, then backtrack. Why is it logical? Is it because the author is including facts or statistics? That's a choice. Including facts to make a logical argument is a choice. So that would be one. Anecdotes, like a little story, are less common, but they happen. Examples, I feel like a lot of writers and speakers use examples. Usually with examples, it's either one major example or like 3 or 4 smaller examples that are all kind of paired together. But examples happen a lot. So that would be something to look for. There's always word choice and the tone that it creates. So looking at like why they chose those words could be helpful. I'm trying to think of some other ones that are usually there. Comparison. So like there's a bunch of things that fall under comparison. So like similes, metaphors, allusions can technically be comparisons, but so just comparison. And then contrast. Another fancy word for that is juxtaposition. So those would be the major ones. But yeah, I did a video on this last year that kind of has like a few of the major ones. But really a choice is what the writer is doing. So if they're acknowledging something, if they're clarifying something, if they're flattering their audience, those are all active verbs, and those are choices as well. So my students have said there's a few passages out there where they're like, I don't see a clear-cut choice. And I'll tell them, okay, back up. Like, what are they doing? They're like, oh, well, he's doing this, or like he's creating a common enemy. Okay, cool. That's a choice. So if you're like having like a total blank moment on the test and you're like, I don't see a single choice that I recognize, just ask yourself, what are they doing? And I find it helps to go chronologically through a passage because the author has a line of reasoning. So kind of divide it up. So what are they doing in the beginning, middle, and end? Because if you follow their line of reasoning and figure out what they're doing in the beginning, middle, and end, and why they're doing it in that order, that will help your essay. Let's see. You can wear a watch as long as it's not an Apple Watch. Yeah, it can't like send or receive messages. You can have a digital watch as long as it's not going to like beep. But yeah, it can't be a smart watch. How do you layer evidence for rhetorical analysis essays? Okay, so the formula that I give my students is like topic, sentence, evidence, commentary, concluding sentence. Now that's just like a guide. That doesn't literally mean you need that exact number of sentences. It could be more. It's just like a template, if you will. So if you want to see this in action, I did a recent video called like Plan With Me, and I go through Madeleine Albright's speech and I go through how I would layer it. I don't have a paragraph written in that particular video, but I do have like, here's how you plan for it. That might show it more clearly. And then I wish I could remember the name of the video. Recently I did one where I was looking at like Pearl Harbor because that's one of my favorite speeches to teach. Let me see if I can find it really quickly to tell you, but I've done it. If you look at some of my rhetorical analysis videos, I've demonstrated it, but the idea is to choose like short quotes. And so you would provide the evidence that fits what your main idea is, and then some commentary about it, and then move on to like either another piece of evidence that proves the same point or like is related somehow. So we don't just want one piece of evidence per paragraph. We want more than that. I'm trying to see if I can find the name of that video really quick for you, but I don't know. So the plan with me is pretty current. I would think that one would show it. How to select evidence. It might be that one. Let me see. Sorry. I just can't always remember which videos it is. Yeah, I think the how to select evidence might also show that as well. So those would be two if you want like further explanation. Your videos help. Well, thanks. I try. I just want to make sure you guys feel as prepared as possible. For digital test takers, do you have a plan for studying that you recommend? I haven't really given too much thought to digital yet. Once this paper test is over, I promise I will like actually start to think about digital. But I would say know the order of the test is like important because the multiple choice is going to be in a different order. You're still having the exact same number of passages as everybody else, but it's a different order. And then your essays are in a different order. I think it was like for digital, it was like argument synthesis, rhetorical analysis. So I would just read up on like the College Board's policies, and I don't know what they call it, but there's some sort of like browser or like practice something. I think it tests for like compatibility, but I would check that as well. And then as far as like pacing, know that you can't go back to questions. So you don't want to linger on stuff that you don't know, but like you won't be able to circle back even on the essays. So you're going to kind of have to decide, okay, like, what is the like bare minimum I need to do? Or like in a panic situation, you don't want to do the bare minimum in general, but like if you've spent 40 minutes on it, you need to decide like, did I meet a 4 out of 6? Is that my goal? If I can give myself 5 more minutes, will it help my score? Because you're not going to be able to see the other essays to know what's coming. So, I would be familiar with like the rubric and like the way things are going to be presented to you to be more strategic for digital test taking. But yeah, it almost feels like you guys are kind of going in blind a little bit more so than the paper test, but there are advantages to digital too. Like if you're a fast typer, that could help. So yeah, I'll try to put together like more tips after Wednesday. But I appreciate your patience with me for that. How is the test formatted? Sorry, you wrote it correctly. I just can't read. Is there limited space? Okay, so for essays, from what I remember, they're like shrink wrapped. Like there's 2 packets in like saran wrap looking stuff. So everybody opens it at the same time. And then there's also these stickers that you get that you put like under your desk or something. The stickers seal your essay book so nobody can tamper with it. You're going to get a packet that has all your prompts in it, and you can write in that one. And then you get like a booklet. And as far as I know, nobody that I have heard of in our school has ever ran out of paper. But if you do, the proctor is supposed to be able to give you paper to like insert into your booklet or something, if you're really worried about it. But, double check with your AP coordinator. If you have large handwriting or you just write long essays and you're worried about running out of paper, it's rare that it would happen, but there is supposed to be protocol in place. Don't skip lines because that would definitely waste a lot of paper. And on the booklet, you can write front and back. So please do. Choose a good pen that's not going to bleed through. But yeah, use your paper effectively. I would say don't start like one essay on the same page as another though. Like you want it to be on a separate page. So if you've never seen AP paper, it's lined paper, but there's this little box in the top right corner and you write for the paper test, if it's synthesis, you write Q1 in that box. If you've looked at some of the samples from the College Board that are handwritten, that's what it looks like. So you would put Q1 in the box for each page of your Q1 essay. But yeah, blue or black ink for the essays. Don't skip lines. If it's front and back, write front and back. So choose a pen that doesn't bleed through if at all possible. And basically what will happen is when you're done, they'll instruct you. Don't do anything until your proctor tells you to do it. But like there's going to be stickers that you have to like seal it up with and stuff. There's this whole prompt that they have to do. So you can use the test booklet with the prompt booklet as scratch paper as well. I have heard of kids using their essay packet with all the paper as like scratch paper, but they wrote really small on purpose. So they didn't waste too much paper. And then on the digital test, I think you get scratch paper, but I could be wrong. If anyone knows, let me know in the comments. But yeah, you should have enough paper. Like they're supposed to give you plenty. What are the different types of questions for synthesis? The two that I've seen most common on AP Classroom recently, they could phrase it as like, so they're going to say develop a position, but it's like develop a position on the role, if any, blank should play in the future. So like they did libraries. There's one about zoos on AP Classroom. There might be more. Post offices might have been one. So anyway, like what is the role of X in the future? And then they could also phrase it as develop a position on the most important changes or factors, and then like whatever the prompt's about. So my students did one recently on AP Classroom where it was like the most important changes, and it had something to do with the wage gap. And then previously they used to use the word factors. So like the locavore prompt and a few others, wind farms have all been factors. I don't know if they're going to use the word factors or not, but changes, factors, that kind of thing. So just really make sure you're clear on what they're asking. But there's a few different like question stems that they could use. So just be really clear on what they want you to talk about. But yeah, your rhetorical analysis videos helped. Well, thank you. A pro to digital is that you don't have to write things in pen. Yeah, and your hand's not going to cramp up because 3 essays in 2 hours and 15 minutes, like you're going to feel it. Just FYI. For the essays, do we have to follow MLA style? I mean, like, do we have to indent the first sentence? I don't know that I've ever said, because they don't want you to skip lines. I think what skipping lines means, like literally skipping lines, but like I have always had my students indent. But if you don't indent, then yeah, you would want to leave a line in between paragraphs so we know where one paragraph ends and the other one begins. But I've always seen students on the handwritten essays that I've seen, I've always seen them indent. So I would say it's better to indent. That would just be my recommendation. Oh, okay. You mean for the digital? I'm sorry. I thought you meant by like handwritten ones. Sorry. I don't know how to do Times New Roman by hand. Yeah, no, you're just going to handwrite it like normal. And then, but if it's a handwritten essay, then yeah, you just handwrite it. But yeah, indent. Sorry, I totally fell for that. You got me. I was like, what? And then I was like, maybe I'm reading this wrong. So yeah, if that was a joke, you got me. But yeah, no, indent your paragraphs, please, if you're handwriting. For the digital test, they'll probably give you instructions as well. Because last year they had like different instructions, because last year was just like, it was 2020. So it was different. But yeah. Okay, so let me see if there's any other questions or if I missed any. I tried really hard to catch them all in the chat, but are you allowed to bring your own stopwatch? You're allowed to bring your own watch. There should also be a clock in the room, usually. So I know a lot of students prefer like digital clocks, but like, just be able to be mindful of your time. And one tip for that is like, okay, so let's just use 10 o'clock as an example. If you're starting your essay at 10 o'clock, you could, in really, really small letters, numbers, whatever, write like 10 at the top. You can cross it out later if you want to, but like, it's good to kind of remember when you started your essay so you know what time you should be roughly finishing. You don't necessarily have to write it on your essay booklet. Maybe you could write it on like the prompt or something. But if you're really worried about your pacing under stress, sometimes it can be really hard to like figure out what time you started, what time you should be stopping, that kind of thing. So if you kind of give yourself little cues, that could help as well, especially if you're trying to be really strict with your pacing. My teacher tells us to keep a couple lines blank at the beginning. That way we can go back and write context once your brain is warmed up. Yes, I do agree with that for the handwritten test. You can skip a few lines. I believe what most teachers say is skip a few lines, write your thesis if you can, and then kind of like keep going and then go back and figure out your context. And that way, if you don't have time to go back or you can't think of anything, you at least have the rest of your essay in place. So I do think that's a good tip as well. I don't know that I did actually say that in any of my videos though. So that is a good tip that hopefully I can bring up later. But yes, that could work if you can't think of any context. My teacher didn't really teach the content very well, so I kind of feel stuck. Do you have any recommendations? I'm just going to watch a ton of your videos. Yeah, so my best tips are in my videos. My specialty is rhetorical analysis. I don't have a lot of synthesis videos because of copyright. Like, it's a gray area whether or not I could show the College Board resources, and like, I don't want to get in trouble. So I just speak about it more generally. I do have some videos on argument. So I would say, yeah, like the videos can help. Looking at released essays from the College Board can help, that kind of stuff. So I do have a video about how to prepare, which might benefit you as well. But yeah, just like, don't discount yourself, even though you might not feel as prepared as you want to. There's still time to feel prepared, and try to figure out what your strengths are and really embrace those as you go into the test. What can I do to improve my multiple choice success rate? If you notice any trends of the questions you're missing, like if they all are worded a certain way or focus on the same skill, that would be something to consider. And like focusing on that type of question. I would say also just like, if you get a question wrong, and you're practicing, go to the answer key, try to figure out why, especially if you're using like College Board resources. There aren't very many questions out there from the College Board, but there is AP Classroom if your teachers assign stuff on that. And Marco Learning has some good resources as well. So really trying to figure out like why the right answer is right is good. Because I know a lot of my students, they'll tell me like, I can narrow it down to 2 and I always choose the wrong one. So to me, those are the questions where you really want to kind of figure out, okay, why was it this one and not the one I chose? For introductory paragraph, can we just use a thesis, or do we have to write a couple sentences of context? You can just do a thesis. I prefer, like for my students, I prefer that they have a couple sentences of context. However, do they always do that? No. Is it a rule in my classroom? No, it's a recommendation. Because let's face it, on test day, it's high stakes. You're stressed out. You don't even know the prompts you're going to get. Like, so do the best you can. You know you have to have a thesis. If that is the best you can do, maybe leave some space for some context. But if you don't get to it, context is like the least important part. Besides, like, and conclusions are not necessary either. The key is going to be the body paragraphs. So do what you need to do to prioritize those body paragraphs. How many multiple choice questions we need to get if we want a 5? And you usually write 5 out of 6. Okay, this is just a guess here because I don't know. They haven't like, we won't know a lot of this until after y'all take the test and everything is scored. And if then, we might not know. I would say 70% could, and 5 out of 6 is on the essays, could be a low 5. If it's upwards of 70%, then that's going to be better. But it's all like a range. So I would say your minimum, if you're writing 5s out of 6s on your essays consistently and you're shooting for a 5, the minimum multiple choice I would say is roughly 70%. Obviously, if it's more than that, it's better. But that would be my best guess. Strive for 100. Yeah, I've never actually had a student make 100 on multiple choice, but I have had a student make a 41 out of 44 twice. But yeah, she's like super talented at multiple choice. But yeah, like my best students, like absolute best students, come in at like 80%, and a couple have come in at like around 90%. Most of my students right now are at 60 to 65%. I have a couple that are trailing at like 50 to 55. It's the best that they can do. Not everybody's good at multiple choice. But my goal for my students is roughly about 55% minimum. And then obviously the more, the better. How many multiple choice questions are there? There are 45. So roughly like 22 to 24 are reading, because there's 2 passages of reading. And then the remainder is the writing. So you're going to have 3 writing passages. They are shorter and they have fewer questions. Yeah, multiple choice is tough. I felt that. Yeah, like I don't know. That's my least favorite part. Like I just don't like multiple choice. I would rather write essays. I know not everybody agrees, but like just do the best you can. And if the multiple choice is really hard, like if you're taking the paper test, I had this conversation with one of my students earlier. I gave her a practice test from AP Classroom and she's like, yeah, that first passage was really hard. Second passage, not so bad. Writing was good. And I'm like, okay, did you linger on the really hard passage? And she was like, well, yeah. And I was like, don't do that. Like, now make sure you're matching up your answers on your answer key. But like if the passage is hard on the paper test, now digital, it's different, but paper test, move on because like the other passages might not be hard and you don't want to waste time and like rush at the end. So for paper test, you have that luxury of moving around. Just please match it up to your answer key. Because if you are off by one question, that would really screw you up. I'm in that 55 percentile as well. I hope my essay skill can carry me. Yeah, I think it can. Like, some people are just better at writing, to be honest. Are we allowed to listen to study music while taking the test? Unfortunately, no, because it would come from a device and you're not allowed to have devices in the testing room, at least at our school. I don't know if it's like that everywhere. But our school, you can't enter the testing room with a phone or anything. And if you have a smartwatch, you have to take it off. So yeah, no music. Is writing like grammar from the SAT? Not exactly. So if you're looking at the writing and language SAT questions, look for the questions that have a question stem, which is like the question above it. So those are the ones where it's like, the writer is thinking of adding or deleting a sentence. Should they? Yes or no, whatever. Those are the ones you want to look at. Or like, how could the writer effectively combine these sentences? Or whatever they are. Go for those questions. They're not going to ask you questions about like the ones where it's like, you know, like, is the semicolon used correctly? Where there's like, it's just like a line level edit. Those are not on there. I sort of wish they were because my students are good at those. But no, they're going to have the ones where it's like a question above it. So if you want to use the SAT to practice, that can be a good way to do it, but use the ones that have a question above it. So it would only be about like 3 to 5 per passage tops. That would actually be helpful. If you're taking the exam at home, can you use your phone as a timer? Good question. I haven't really brushed up on those things yet. There should be a timer on the platform itself because like last year there was, and they had like, it would turn red with like 5 minutes left. What I know is that initially they said, oh, we're going to like have cameras on. And then they said, no, we're not. And like, there was this whole big thing with that. I would try to find out that answer in writing from the College Board. I'm sorry, I don't know the answer right now. I will try to find out. And if anyone knows, please help. But I haven't really looked into the digital stuff yet, but, I don't know. I don't know how they would know if you did, but I just wouldn't want to encourage someone to do something that is explicitly against the rules. So please look into that. I'm sorry, I don't know. What about doing the multiple choice? When doing the multiple choice, should we jump into the questions because it references, or should we just do a cold read? Okay, so if I'm understanding right, like the ones where it says like, when you say like references, like when it says like the first paragraph or lines, whatever, those are usually easier to answer under pressure and in isolation. Whereas some of the other questions where it's like, just like about the whole passage in general, or it doesn't give you like a specific paragraph or line number, those you do have to read a bit more closely. What has worked for me personally, but does not work for everybody, is reading. I like to read the questions first to see what I'm up against. Don't read the answer choices because that's just a waste of time and distracting. And then I will kind of like bracket off the ones that ask about a certain paragraph or lines. That way I can like visually go to that without having to like skim through stuff. So if you are pressed for time, answering those questions about like only the first paragraph or only the last paragraph, that can help. But some of the questions are going to be about the whole passage. So you should, in theory, at some point read the passage in its entirety, but can you answer certain questions without having read the whole thing? Technically, yes. So if you're pressed for time, like if you have 5 minutes left and you're somehow going back to a reading passage or whatever, I would prioritize those that reference a certain part if you can. Let's see. What online source would be good to prepare for the multiple choice section? So the two that I recommend would be using the SAT like from the College Board, SAT practice tests, or Marco Learning. They have like some free practice tests that they do. Out of all the practice test companies out there, I trust them the most. I like using stuff from the College Board, but remember the SAT is not identical to AP Lang. So there's certain questions on the SAT that are not on AP Lang. But I do have a couple videos where I mentioned like how to prepare for the exam. And I think I specify in those videos like which questions on the SAT are not on the AP Lang test. But yeah, those would be the two that I would choose. And they're free. I wouldn't go out and buy a test book at this point, just because I don't really think they're super helpful. Okay, so the digital timer, you can hide it, but in the last 5 minutes it shows up. You can't make it go away. Yeah, that's how it was last year too. If it's going to be a distraction and you want to hide it, that's fine. I would want to know. And that's why, like, if your computer obviously tells you the time too, if it's visible, you can make note that way. But yeah, if you want to pace yourself, just make sure you're aware of like what the requirements are. Is it okay if we do an introduction and 2 body, or should there be 3 in place of a conclusion? So honestly, I've seen it where students only have time for an intro and 2 bodies, and as long as they were well developed, it was okay. Especially for rhetorical analysis and probably argument. I think it happens less on synthesis from what I've seen with my own students, but it could. So yeah, if you only have time for an intro and 2 bodies and they're developed body paragraphs, that's what you've got. If you can write a conclusion that is meaningful, go for it. If you have time, if you have a time for a 3rd body paragraph, but no conclusion, go for it. Just do what's going to help you develop your analysis the best. But just know that there are times when students have only had time to write an intro and 2 body paragraphs, and they've still done okay. So keep that in mind as well. But yeah, I have a couple students who like, they'll do an intro and 2 bodies and then like time's up. And we just know this. I tell them, I don't know if this is like good advice or not, but I always tell them to write did not finish. Just because like as their teacher, I like to know that they didn't finish. Sometimes it's really obvious that they didn't finish. I just tell them to. I don't think it means anything. I don't think a scorer is going to have pity on you or anything, but like I just tell them to do it. So I don't know. It might not actually matter. How much time should we give ourselves for each passage? And the questions in the multiple choice. Okay, so this is a little tricky because like first, like I feel like there are students for whom the reading takes longer, but remember you have 2 reading and 3 writing passages. And I personally can answer like the writing questions more quickly. So if you're taking the paper test, I've had students ask like, should it be 30 and 30? And like, it doesn't have to be like, so it's hard because like it doesn't, to me, it doesn't work to take like, oh, you have 1 hour, 45 questions. It's this many like seconds or minutes per question. Cause like you have to take into account that you're reading too. So if you are taking the paper test, I would say, there's going to be, well, first of all, there's going to be 5 passages, or they call them reading sets now, I think, but there's going to be 2 reading, 3 writing. So if you get to like 35 minutes and you haven't started your writing yet, your writing multiple choice yet, I would move on. But some students pace faster than that anyway. So I think it's just kind of like figure out what your strengths are. I have a couple students who the writing questions are what they're good at. So they need to make sure they have plenty of time for those. And the reading, like, we've kind of had this conversation, like, if you're going to get it wrong anyway, don't spend 5 minutes and still get it wrong. And I don't mean that in like a mean way. I just mean like, you know, like move on, like make your best guess and move on. Do you recommend underlining the thesis? That way the AP reader kind of knows. Honestly, like I tend to see students write the thesis as the last sentence of the intro. And so like, that's where I instinctively look for it. And so I don't feel like I have trouble finding it. If it's not in the last sentence of the intro, then I immediately go to the conclusion if I'm grading it for class purposes and see if it's there. And then if it's not there, then I start looking at topic sentences. If you feel that would help you, or if you are worried that they would somehow miss it, that's okay. But like the readers are going to be trained to find it. And quite frankly, for the thesis point, because you didn't get a thesis point back in the day, it was just kind of part of it. they're trained to like look for it, and it's really like easy to earn that point, if you will. So I don't think you have to call attention to it, because there are so many things that are considered defensible that I don't think it would hurt to do it, but like I don't think it's going to be a problem. So yeah. Any other final questions or anything? How do you get better at multiple choice? Oh gosh, I wish I had better answers for this. Excuse me. I apologize for coughing. I would say pacing is important. Eliminate wrong answers. And just kind of like pay attention to the nuances of how stuff is worded, because sometimes the wording really matters. But yeah, I don't have any like magical tips. I wish I did. Like multiple choice is just not my favorite thing to teach. And so I feel like I just don't, like, I love teaching about writing essays, but multiple choice, I'm just like, like, I don't know. So if anyone else has good tips, let me know. But yeah, so thank you guys for checking out this live. If you have video requests or anything, feel free to leave comments on the videos. I try to be responsive to those as well. And I will be posting some more videos between now and Wednesday. And then once it's time for like the digital tests, I'll try to focus more on digital test prep as well. So yeah, feel free to leave comments on the videos and let me know what you guys need. And I would be happy to help you as well. But yeah, happy studying. Don't stress too much. You've got this. You're awesome. You can do it. So yeah, thank you guys and have a good rest of your weekend.